welcome to Digital Transformation Survivors. I'm your host, Julian Tedstone, and we're here to really, I guess, talk about the challenge of running complex web estates. So this is where you're looking after multiple audiences, segmented technologies, all working together to try and make a sensible platform. We are here today to welcome Mr. Tony Byrne. I'm very, very excited. He is the founder of the Real Story Group. And for those of you that are familiar with the Real Story Group, fiercely independent analyst firm, provide, and I'm going to do a quote unquote here, tough love in the vendor evaluations and that help organizations to reach really, really good decisions around MarTech platforms. So Tony brings many years of experience and insight into helping organizations to make those really good choices from a very, very independent point of view. So I'm really, really happy to welcome him here today. Tony, welcome. How are you doing?
Thanks, Julian. Really good. This beautiful summer day.
Fantastic. Yeah. Well, it's slightly overcast here in London. I know you're in Washington, so we'll press on through the English summer over here. So Tony, it'd be great. I mean, it would be great to learn a little bit more about yourself, around the Real Story Group, how that came to be. What led you to create the organization, and how did you see that fitting? What was its purpose?
Yeah. Thanks, Julian. Well, I started Real Story Group really out of frustration about 2 decades ago. I was working at a what we would call today a design build agency, systems integrator, hybrid firm. We were implementing kind of version 1 of a number of web content management systems and search engines and web applications. And we licensed some research from traditional analyst firms that were out there at the time, Gartner, Forrester, of course, Yankee Group, and others. And our experience implementing the tools that were in the so-called upper right or winners quadrant was very different than what the analyst firms were saying. In fact, it was getting us into trouble because we'd have clients who said, look, this is a highly rated system. How are you possibly having trouble with it? And we were like, this is a really problematic platform for XYZ. And so I thought there needed to be really a better way to tell the real story about what these tools were. So I went off on my own originally to found the origin company, which was actually CMS Watch. So we started evaluating 16 web content management systems in the 2000s. And we made a decision very early on that if we were going to be really tough evaluators, we could only work on the buyer side of the table. Turns out this is something of a unique business model in the analyst world, where most analyst firms make most of their money from vendors. We always thought that was a conflict of interest. So we've been evaluating vendors and helping typically larger enterprises select vendors for the last 2 decades. Now we kind of span the whole MarTech stack, 10 different marketplaces, from email marketing to customer data platforms and everything in between. And then the other thing that sort of evolved over time is we started getting asked by some of our larger clients to take a look at the whole stack, or take a look at their digital estate globally, which led us to sort of helping organizations with their technology decision-making kind of more generally.
So that's really quite a journey. And yet still today, everyone's word seems to hang on, where they're being positioned top right in that quadrant. Do you still think those quadrants, carry a lot of weight? And I guess, how do you fight to combat that view of the view of the world?
It's just as bad as it was a quarter century ago, if not actually worse. And what you find are vendors that are very good at so-called analyst relations, which is really just a form of lobbying, unregulated lobbying, I'll add, tend to be in the upper right-hand quadrant. They tend to favor very large vendors. It's one of the reasons why, for example, Adobe and Salesforce, who are very problematic vendors in their own right, often are listed as winners when in fact they cause probably more grief than any other vendors we see.
Yeah.
It's why analyst firms were very late, I think 5 or 6 years late in seeing the decline of platforms like Interwoven TeamSite, Sitecore XP, which is really in a kind of a tailspin right now. I continue to believe that these kind of static quadrants cause a lot of damage, not just to firms, but also individual DX and marketing technology leaders. It can be damaging to your career. So it's deeply unfortunate, but it's a fact of life.
And I guess because they carry so much weight, it's almost like no one ever got fired for following them, I suppose. It's a safety option to weigh in there. But
yeah, I mean, we're seeing that a little bit less and less. It is a safety option. It's more that smarter organizations use them maybe just to validate a particular decision rather than to actually drive a particular decision. Yeah. I mean, most of our customers do have licenses to some other analyst firms. They just pick and choose where they're going to pay attention, and they typically don't pay attention anymore when it comes to web CMS because the quadrants are just ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, this kind of brings us to the part of the conversation that we've been exploring. So if you are an organization that, for example, is operating in a number of different territorial markets, geographical markets, or maybe you're an organization that's grown through, acquiring businesses and you've got a bunch of websites, sooner or later, you're going to sit down and try and work out how you consolidate all of this and get it working sensibly off a single platform. And then, I guess, what are your decision-making sources? You're going to go to Gartner, you're going to go to Forrester. That's going to help you start making that conversation. But how do we really work out, which platform is going to serve you best, in that kind of multi-site environment versus, an environment where you might just be looking after a single website?
Yeah, it's a really critical question. It's kind of often the question on the table for larger enterprises, certainly global or international, multinational enterprises. And it's a tough one. And it's not just in the CMS DXP space. We see this for email marketing, for customer data platforms, for other technologies where either through acquisition or natural evolution of different product lines or different geographies, companies end up with different tools or different approaches.
Yeah.
And this is a tough one. The temptation sometimes is to get the most sophisticated platform on the assumption that it's going to support the most possible use cases.
Yeah.
That on the surface seems logical, but is actually one of the worst things you can do because you face a greater risk of overbuying than underbuying. And you turn it all into kind of a development project. So, Julian, it all comes down to use cases at the end of the day, and what's the diversity of use cases that you need to support. There are operational issues related to that, but we're really big believers in the primacy of use cases when you're doing your own requirements gathering, or for that matter, when you're evaluating vendors. We use use cases to evaluate vendors. And sometimes the use cases aren't really as different as you might think. Sometimes they are. We know, geographically, China is sometimes its own world. In Japan, there's a tendency to want to use local suppliers and that sort of thing. So you have to accept sort of reality on the ground. For larger enterprises, we've sometimes seen this kind of two-speed approach where they say, look, we're going to provide a sophisticated platform for companies or products or geographies that are super advanced, and then we're going to have a simpler package for those that aren't. And so you kind of get a choice there. That's not perfect, but it's better than, letting 1,000 flowers bloom.
Yeah.
But I think, this pendulum kind of slips back and forth between globalization and localization. I think, it depends a lot on the business itself. We work with some logistics companies where they're very global.
Yeah.
And to be global, they're going to insist on a single platform.
Yeah.
We work also with consumer product goods where the local markets are everything. And so they let the local markets kind of experiment themselves. And
I think that's a really interesting area to look at, where you have, I guess, that kind of marketing and sales driven imperative, which And that's all about being like hyper local. It's about really understanding your local market. It's about having the freedom to operate into that local market and leverage your understanding of it, versus the need to manage something which has got consistent governance, has got consistent security standards that you can run a clean procurement run against, all of those elements. There's that tension between the need to, I guess, kind of decentralize on the one hand and then centralize on the other. Have you seen situations where that works really well, and have you seen situations where maybe it works less well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it requires strong but sensitive leadership at the center, where you have to be able to distinguish what are things that are really core to the enterprise that we have to insist upon, from a kind of procedural standpoint, and where are we going to let organizations experiment? Not to complicate this further, but it does complicate this further, that it can be you want channel contextualization as well. So the way that you might present in an email channel might be very different than the way that you present in a web channel, and so on. And so you have to kind of address what is central versus what is contextual. One of the things I think we'll talk about several times today is that smarter companies are beginning to realize that there's certain types of content and experiences that they want to be centralized. These are typically micro content components and micro experiences that need to be managed centrally, but then can be reflected. You can have variants or children of them that play out in a particular geography or in a particular channel, but at least it's coming from a solid kind of base. And we have strong opinions about where that base should live, but we'll get into that, I think, a little bit later.
Yeah, super. There's a teaser for a little bit later. I like that. And how well does our industry, and I guess our industry, let's just qualify that a little bit. There's a bunch of people trying to help brands, to make good decisions, and some of those people may also be helping to implement those decisions as well, and then some of them are maintaining the decisions and so on. How well do you observe the decision making process? How well do you observe our ability as an industry to support big brands in making those decisions?
Yeah, so it's a challenge for people sitting in your seat as well. So we recognize that that on the one hand, if you are on the build side of it, you have to have close relationships with 3 or 4 vendors. Hopefully it's more than just one vendor, right? Because otherwise you're just a reseller and kind of a shill, right, for that vendor. On the other hand, sometimes there's clients who need things that you don't necessarily aren't an expert on. And it's the same way, of course, on the business consulting side, that there's certain firms that are really good at governance or maybe taxonomy development or the whole raft of creative things. And so, as a supplier, you have to be honest and be able to partner up with others. And as a customer, you have to be really clear about what's the best what's the best service provider for me, and I may have to juggle multiple service providers. So in general, I think both parties have gotten more sophisticated than they were 10 years ago, and so in general, I see this playing out reasonably well. I think if I had one critique, it's probably that there's still maybe a little bit of excessive focus on the website brand channel in terms of spend and focus relative to the other channels. And I think part of this is, to the extent that this is happening, a lot of it is coming from the enterprise itself. So we can talk about that a little bit later as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So there are some kind of imperatives that are being driven by the organization and some by the partners, and I guess everyone's kind of operating out of what? What is it kind of? Is it kind of like their habit, their comfort zone,
inertia?
And inertia. Yeah. So I guess one of the terms that has been gained currency over the, say, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years, it's probably about 4 years ago that I started to become familiar with the term, is the ability to bring like composable techniques to managing anything from technology to content to workflow to however you want to organize. And I guess that term has kind of gained a lot of currency. What does it mean to you? And as opposed to how do you think it's being used in the vernacular?
Yeah, boy, how much time do we have? Yeah, so, we're big believers that your stack should be composable. In other words, you don't want to take a web CMS from a vendor that happens to be your email vendor and vice versa, or get a customer data platform from a vendor that, happens to be your social media platform. That these kinds of vertical binding is not good in the real world. And so to that extent, we're a little bit different, because that, again, is an area where large analyst firms sometimes encourage their customers to do this. We think this is bad for your company and bad for your career. So we believe in a composable stack. I think when it comes down to the components within that stack, let's say web CMS, our vision of composable might be a little bit different than some others. So sometimes you will hear IT or data people say, I want this broken down into a set of microservices, and that will make my life easier. And there's some truth to that. The question you have to ask is whether it makes the business user's life easier. And sometimes it doesn't, right? And so if as a business user, I'm having to do this swivel chair where I'm constantly kind of moving between systems, whereas a single system might have put some things together in a useful way for me, then that's problematic. And I think we saw this with the headless revolution, where headless had always been around. It's a useful architecture to have, but there's times when you need a headful or coupled platform, like if you're published. And so a vendor that's very religious about this says, no, we only do headless. That was problematic for a lot of business users. So now we see this idea of hybrid headless. So, there's pros and cons to composability. Where we really wish we could see vendors be composable, and they're not always, is in something you might not think, which is at the engagement tier, like a web CMS. We would want that CMS to be able to draw customer data from somewhere else, to be able to draw component content from somewhere else, to be able to draw personalization rules from somewhere else. That's the kind of composability we want to see. And for vendors, it's tough because they're used to kind of being the center of the universe and the decision maker. And we think the future of web CMS and a number of engagement channels is going to be less that they're a decision maker and more that they're an order taker. Yes. That some of the key content and data and decisions are going to come from lower level platforms for a lot of good reasons. We call this a legless CMS. And now I know that in your part of the world, legless can mean inebriated. So
that's important context, here, Tony. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, for our UK
we
viewers,
need to find a better term for this. But the good news is that this is a simpler CMS, one that has a narrower scope and is leveraging the best of the enterprise. But those services are coming from elsewhere. Anyway, we can talk about that more later. But I think when we come to composability, for most CMS vendors, it's really just, can I sell you some more stuff? And we don't really see the reason why you should buy multiple tools from Sitecore or Adobe or even Acquia. It's going to be sheer coincidence that it makes sense for you.
And I guess really you wanted to do best. You kind of want to choose the best in class tools, and you want to get them. I guess kind of it's a poor term, but you want to get them knitted together as elegantly as possible. But I guess the pushback against that is that you have there's a lot of complexity then under the hood. So actually, where does this data sit, and which system should be most appropriately tasked with managing any given piece of data? So the complexity kind of moves behind the scenes, doesn't it? And you have to then start making some really good decisions about what you are tasking different parts of that platform to do, I guess.
That's right. I mean, I think that the first thing that I would say is that getting all of these or many of these platforms from the same vendors doesn't eliminate that complexity and doesn't eliminate the need for integration. So this is just an evergreen problem that we all have, which is how do we integrate these vast moving parts, each of which have their own, technologies, and that's an evergreen problem for us. So enterprise architecture is very important. Having strong product management of these domains is really important. And when those two are in place, then you're making clearer decisions about what renders onto what. You still have to be flexible sometimes about this, clearly. So having a real plan for your stack and a real roadmap is really the only way to solve that problem, in our opinion.
So that leads on quite nicely to the next question, which is how well do you see the platforms planning? How are they conducting that? I don't want to name names, but what does good look like in terms of planning an effective platform roadmap that's taking into consideration all of these factors and doing right by the people that are procuring it?
Yeah, you mean like on the enterprise, on the customer side, or more on the vendor side? Yeah. So I think, you first want to start with a model of what the future looks like. And this is a lot of the work that we do is we start with kind of an as is, and then we project it to be. Inevitably, you have to have one of these layer cake diagrams that for better or worse, that show exactly what you're doing now. And sometimes that can be very eye-opening in terms of where you may have multiple vendors in one box and other boxes with no vendor at all. And is that intentional or not? So really starting with an as is and then going to a to be. And then having a product strategy that is not necessarily geared towards a platform. So, you could have a product manager just for outbound engagement. That's all about email, SMS, WhatsApp, dropship postcard, outbound telephony, things where marketers are trying to reach out and touch someone, maybe even paid media, and then have another product manager for inbound, which could be content, not just to your website, but content and experiences going to web applications and that sort of thing. So it's, you're thinking about a domain rather than necessarily a series of platforms. Now, to be sure, this is a large enterprise problem, right? So when we see smaller or mid-sized enterprises, you don't necessarily have the staffing or the sophistication. And so we are starting to see more Swiss Army knife platforms, like what some people call customer engagement platforms, or CEPs, which have a number of capabilities bolted into a single platform. And this can work very well for a mid-market firm, probably not going to work well for a larger enterprise. So the size kind of matters here.
But that's a potential headache down the road right there, isn't it? So if you're on a growth platform, we see this actually going both ways. We see kind of mid-market organizations on fantastic growth curves outgrowing their platforms, wondering, if we're going to invest in a new platform, what's the time horizon on this? How long was it going to last? Versus other organizations going the other way, where they're looking to find cost reductions, risk reductions, simplification, consolidation, and they're trying to work out how they get to something a little bit more elegant and right sized for what they're trying to do. It doesn't feel like sometimes there's an awful many platforms that grow elegantly between the different types of user need and size complexity.
I mean, there's a fundamental difference between a platform or a vendor that wants to provide a number of things in one solution and more best of breeds. You're really crossing a Rubicon. And you make a really great point that in the best of breed world, there are lots of opportunities to sort of downshift your investments and downshift to simpler platforms. We've been coaching many enterprises over the last 2 years about how to get off of Adobe AAM, how to get out of Sitecore, because these are just causing them more problems than it's worth. Even large enterprises, they're in a world now where they have an effective stack strategy where they can get simpler at the engagement tier. We tend to see it less where a customer is sort of outgrowing, except when they have things that are 10, 12 years old and were really designed for a small business, as opposed to a medium-sized business. Those are the sorts of things. We see that a lot, for example, in the email marketing world, where you have a lot of random vendors that have just never gone anywhere and bear replacement. But I think we continue to argue, even though it seems a little bit unconventional, that you do face a greater risk of overbuying than underbuying.
Yeah. Yes. And I guess it's no huge shock that it's, easy to buy something which expands than it is to go the other way. I mean, vendors are going to be structuring their platforms with fantastic growth strategies, but not perhaps the greatest consolidation capabilities within them. But, it feels like, or maybe that's unfair, but it feels like it's a need to be able to flex both ways, given, your what position you might be in a business cycle, to your point, whether you're on, the curve where you're into a localization cycle versus a globalization cycle. It feels like there needs to be enough flexibility in those systems to take their users in a number of different directions.
Yeah, and it's hard because vendors can't be all things to all customers, or they end up being nothing for everyone. So, the good news is that nearly all of these 10 marketplaces across the MarTech and DX world are what we describe as highly fragmented marketplaces. So fragmented is analyst speak for, there's a hell of a lot of vendors in each category. And so you can get to 2 or 3 that are likely going to be a good fit for you. And then you really want to kind of understand at that point the vendor and how is, where is the vendor going, and are they going in the same direction as you are? And that can take a little bit of time to figure out, but is very useful, very worthwhile exercise.
So that's interesting. So that almost suggests, I mean, obviously part of that conversation is around technology roadmap, but is some of that also cultural?
Absolutely cultural, and their vision for the future. Of course, right now you have to sift through a lot of AI nonsense and some AI goodies. But really, who are they trying to serve? I mean, even if we look at the Drupal ecosystem, which I think you're pretty familiar with, what is Drupal today and where is it going? These are interesting questions, of course, that the community asks itself. Acquia, of course, has a big say in this, particularly as far as enterprises are concerned. And really understanding, I think, to me, the big question in the Drupal world that gets answered pretty consistently is it a CMS or is it a whole website, suite of applications in a box? I tend to think it's the latter. That's very handy for many customers, not the right solution for others. So, what is this that we're working with is a very basic question, and where is the community or the platform going? What's their vision for how it fits? Is really important.
So you mentioned the word there. I think no discussion in these days is going to go very far without mentioning those 2 letters, which is AI. So let's just talk a little bit about looking ahead. What are the things that really exciting you about the digital experience? Platform world. What are you seeing? Where do you see it going? What's really exciting?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 things that are exciting. One of them scares me a little bit, but the exciting piece, it's so interesting. And I'm sure you see this too, that very often when an enterprise thinks about AI, they're thinking about generative AI.
Yeah.
And of course, every CMS is lighting up generative AI features in their platform. They're just showing up, right? And we tend to think that generative AI is actually the least important in the future of the 3 types of AI. So we break down in generative AI, insights AI, which helps you understand your this vast swath of data that we're all collecting, and then decisioning AI, which basically says who should have what experience at what time for what reason. And in the future of MarTech and customer experience, we think insights AI is the most immediately useful. It may be outside the scope of your team, but it's where I think a lot of great things are already happening. A lot of things that you might not have been able to do before. Decisioning, which we would all like to do better, including personalization, next best action, but it's so hard to do it and it's so labor intensive that's the other. And we tend to think that generative AI is going to end up being downstream from those two. In other words, insights are going to tell you, hey, there's this interesting segment here that you wouldn't have thought of, but it actually exists. Decisioning AI says, let's break it into 5 categories and send them 5 different messages. And generative AI is going to help you create those 5 messages in a less labor intensive way. So I think that's the first thing, is that generative AI is likely going to be, more downstream from other types of AI. The second thing that is super interesting, but we also have to be very cautious about, is, of course, the rise of agents. And agents are also just going to start showing up in your platform. To paraphrase Leon Trotsky, you might not be interested in agents, but agents are very interested in you. And so I am at once enthusiastic, but also concerned about this, because there's an enormous amount of education that needs to happen. And an intensity of the governance structures that hopefully you're already putting in place. But I think that agents are going to, upend the existing AI world to the extent that it exists in some interesting ways.
And when we're talking about agents, are you specifically referring to agents that are, in service of the brand, i.e., delivering a web experience or a customer experience, or are you also thinking about agents that are, increasingly being deployed by the user as the way the user interacts with the web?
Yeah, excellent question. I was thinking more the former, but the latter is really important to bring up, right? That this is yet another customer experience, almost another channel to have to deal with. And we're already seeing that to some extent by having, instead of SEO, answer optimization and that sort of thing. So we're already having to deal with that. But you can't necessarily control that. You have to deal with that. What's under your control is how you use agents yourself within the enterprise. And we think that there's 2 types that are going to prop up. One is what we call workflow agents, which are basically, they're going to just show up within your platform and only work within that platform. So they have a limited purview. And the other are going to be orchestration agents that work across platforms. And the orchestration agents are where the real magic is going to happen, but it's going to be complicated getting there.
So that statement is going to be complicated getting there. So, elsewhere we hear about enterprises almost kind of like seeing themselves in a fresh way, seeing themselves not just as consumers of technology now, but as producers of technology. So, everyone is becoming their own product development and maintenance organization. What does that mean? Does that mean that now we're all, as enterprises, we're all now rolling our own code and we're managing our own roadmaps?
You are managing your own roadmaps always. So product management is really important. My wish for enterprises that are not native software developers is they don't have to roll a lot of their own code. You will always be responsible at some level for integration. And so constantly working on integration, constantly coming up with new integration models, leveraging new tools. And that's a lot what orchestration agents are, essentially our integration modules. And when you look at, we're looking very hard at the agent technology marketplace right now, and it spans from, very code intensive agent developers to more WYSIWYG browser based agent development, which has all the pros and cons, and then everything in between, right? So hopefully you don't have to be in the software development business, but you will always be in the integration business. There's no escape from that in this multi-channel world.
Okay, big question. Will we have websites in 5 years' time?
Yeah, I think we will. And because there's always going to be that sort of person or bot that needs to look up some basics about you. And there's just whatever your offering is, there's going to need to be some generic information around it. I do believe what has already happened, and we've been slow to catch up to it, is that websites, as we understand them, are less and less and less relative importance in your overall stack. So I would never, as a former journalist, say that they're unimportant because content is terribly important to what you're doing. But relative to all the different customer touch points, I believe that we're over-investing in websites in terms of spend right now, and that much of the content for your website is going to come from a lower level repository, which is not going to be a WCM. And your WCM is really just going to be about experience orchestration and certain long form content that is web native. And we're going to see more enterprise component content migrate lower in your stack so that it can be available in more places. This is happening very rarely in the world right now, but we do see it happening. And so that is both exciting, but also complicates things.
Marvelous. Well, Tony, I've really enjoyed speaking with you today. Is there anything that I haven't asked that you think I should have asked today? It's a good question. I think we've covered a lot of different issues. I think the one thing that we really, I focused on legless, that ideally your web content management system is legless, your email platform is legless, your chatbot is legless, in the sense that you'll be getting content and data and decision logic from somewhere else. This is a fundamental change to the architecture. I think it's going to happen over the next 5 years. I think AI is not going to solve this problem for us. It's just going to be kind of an accelerator of this. And so now it's never been as good a time it is right now to really rethink this from an architectural standpoint. And then, of course, what are the relative, governance issues there? I think you have more and better things to say about governance than I do. But I think, when it comes to AI in particular, I would just caution people about turning on the AI that just sort of shows up willy-nilly in your different platforms. Whether it's your creative platforms or your web platforms, is that you want to put those through the same enterprise screen that you put through your other AI. And if you don't have an enterprise screen, then you want to be very careful about turning it on. And so we tend to think that AI in the future is probably going to be more of a layer that gets injected into your platform. So you'll still be able to use it within your platform, but it's going to be yet another external service that you don't necessarily want from your CMS vendor. So, the net of this is your CMS is going to be a much lighter platform. And in a way, that's a good thing. You'll be less complicated. You'll spend less money on it. You'll free up resources to redeploy elsewhere. Marvelous. Well, that is very clear and a wonderful message to go forward, advice for our listeners. Tony, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed speaking with you today. It's been a real insight, and thank you again. I wish you all the very best.
Julian, thanks for inviting me aboard. It was really a pleasure chatting with you today.
Will you come back in a year's time and we can compare notes?
Sure, yeah. We can see whether any of these predictions hold water or not.
All right, that's great. Thank you so much, Tony. You take care.